Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations, brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Matt Plummer, founder of Zarvana, a science-based approach to train you to think smarter, work faster, and get better results. Thank you, Matt, for joining us, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Okay, so you have a lot of articles about a lot of different topics that kind of work in the professional working type world. And our audience sometimes is teenagers, parents, young college grads, all types of different things. So let's get started. Oh, goodness. Just explain to me what you do on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, my day to day is each day looks kind of different because I do a number of different things. But with Zarvana, the core thing that we're doing is training companies, nonprofits, and government agencies. And so we'll have a session where we lead people through specific tools and strategies that they can be using to, whether it's become more productive and efficient, use critical thinking to solve problems, manage people better, or communicate more effectively. And so that's a big piece of it. Also do some one-on-one coaching. We're working with an individual to help them either achieve certain goals or overcome certain obstacles that they're facing in their professional life.
What's the favorite of those topics that you enjoy the most?
I really like critical thinking and applying critical thinking to how do you think about getting to the best decisions. And then what I always like to say is that good communication flows from good thinking. And so that's why I really like communication, because it's a natural outflow of quality thinking. And so a lot of times people say, oh, well, I don't feel like I'm a great communicator. And it's like, well, let me understand how you're thinking about it, because that will determine the quality of your communication.
Okay. And you've been doing this work for 2017, correct?
Yes.
You graduated from Yale with mechanical engineering and psychology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess the reason I bring up the timeline is, how is thinking and communication changing between 2017 and now 2024?
Yeah, it's just to give some background on how I got into this, I was working for a nonprofit consulting firm, essentially, where we would go in and find nonprofits around the country and the world who were having an impact on their community. And then we'd often focus on helping them grow. And so we'd develop a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, connect them to funding, and really try to help them get to the point where they were addressing the challenge. And what I found while I was working there is, in my early days, a lot of people would come there, they'd love it, but the work was demanding. People were working 50, 55 hours a week. And so they'd often leave after 2 years or so and go back to business school or just take a job that was less demanding. And, as I kind of got into it, I said, I really like this work. I don't want to leave after 2 years. And so I want to see if there's a different way of doing this. And so that led me to on this journey to kind of investigate productivity and personal productivity. And what I did was I just said to another coworker, I said, why don't we meet every other week for 30 minutes and we'll talk about productivity? And we didn't really know what we were doing. We spent 6 months doing that and had nothing to stand for it. And we're like, well, that wasn't very productive. But then we reframed it and we said, well, what if we think about this as if it were a client case? Because we were working on client cases. We were both performing well in this, consulting firm. And overnight that changed things. And basically, long story short, I went from working 50, 55 hours to under 40 hours a week. So significant drop. And I was spending a good portion of my time on work that I wasn't even being required to do. It's just extra work that I was doing. That got the attention of a lot of our peers. And in short order, we had about 50 people across 3 offices meeting to talk about, how do we get more done in less time? And that is what kind of was the genesis of Zarvana. I ended up leaving there to start a company because I was like, what if I could take this and make this available to more people? And so a lot has changed kind of since then in terms of how you think about productivity, both on the technology side and what I like to say is the other side of the coin to productivity, which is burnout, and how as a society we think about burnout as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I read about the burnout cycle, and I guess that it sparked my interest because working in the field of mental health and just in 2024 with the stress and young people and the pressures. Tell us about the burnout cycle, what you've learned.
Well, one of the things that was really interesting to me is we would do assessments of people, not mental health assessments, but assessments around productivity. And we'd also ask them some questions around burnout and how much they were working. And what I thought going into that is that the people who were working the most hours would be at highest risk of burnout and experiencing the most burnout symptoms. But in actuality, there was no correlation between hours worked and burnout symptoms. And I found that really fascinating and began to think, okay, certainly working more can add stress to your life. But what I realized is that it was often more about how people were handling the stress than it was about the amount of stress that they were encountering. And I came across a really interesting study from what I heard, and this was a few years ago. It was one of the biggest studies on this topic. And what they did is they asked people, they said, okay, if you look back over the last year, what level of stress have you experienced? High, medium, low, no stress. And then they tracked them for 8 years and they measured mortality rate. How many of those folks ended up dying within that 8-year period. And what they found is that, and not surprisingly, those who experienced the highest stress were more likely, significantly more likely to die during that period than those who experienced lower stress. However, they had also asked them one other question at the beginning, that 8 years prior, and they said, what is your perception of how you think stress will affect your health? And some people said, oh, I think stress is going to have a huge impact on my health. It will, really make things difficult. And other people are like, I don't think it'll matter. And when you add that in, it dramatically changes the results. So people who said, I have a high stress life, but I don't think it's going to impact my health, they actually had a lower mortality rate than people who said, I have a low stress life, but I think it will have a significant impact on my health. And so that was a game changer for me because it began to show me that it's not so much, and as you mentioned, I have a mechanical engineering background. And so you test pressure, right? And it's not so much the pressure that you're under necessarily, it's how do you manage that pressure? And so that was kind of, what led me down the road of beginning to think about how do we help people manage stress effectively versus necessarily trying to remove stress, though that sometimes that is necessary or helpful, at least on a temporary basis.
Interesting. So what advice do you have to individuals to manage their stress? And I want to say think about it because I feel like that's part of it as well, but maybe I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, there's a few things that I like to think about when it comes to managing stress, and part of it and gets to how do you define success for yourself. And I think sometimes people feel like, oh, I have there's these really high expectations of me, either self-imposed or externally imposed, that I have to live up to. And if I see myself not living up to those, then I feel a sense of either failure or anxiety, and I feel stress, like, oh, I just never can catch up, or I just can't ever do enough. Like, people express those feelings. And so we have to redefine success in a way that we can actually be in control of achieving that. And so one of the things I talk about, and this is very practical when it comes to professional space, but then I'll extrapolate out from there, but
Sure.
is I like to talk about that if you think about prioritization, there's two modes that you can be operating in when it comes to prioritization. The first mode is what I call ordering mode. And in ordering mode, the key job of prioritization is to do things in the right order. You're going to get everything done. It's just a matter of, okay, what should I do first versus what should I do second, right? And so usually when someone starts either in school, and this is the same thing for school, or in work, they're in ordering mode because the workload is just not that much that they can't handle it. But at some point in your career, if you're kind of progressing and you're becoming more senior, you're taking on more responsibility, you move into what I call culling mode. And in culling mode, the job of prioritization is to figure out what are you going to do and not do. And if you think about what happens in ordering mode, the success is getting everything done. And that's totally achievable. But in culling mode, by definition, that is no longer achievable. You're not going to get everything done. But what happens is when people move from ordering mode to culling mode, they keep the same definition of success. I need to get everything done. And so what happens is they go through every day and they feel like a failure because they didn't get everything done. Oh, my list is so long. I didn't get to everything. It's, it just keeps growing and I'm not catching up on it. Well, you've kept the same definition of success, which no longer applies. And what also happens is, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's something like the Zeigarnik effect, which is that when we have something that's incomplete in our mind, we keep ruminating on it. It keeps coming back. Versus something that's complete, we have closure and our mind moves on. So what that means is, say that you get to the end of the day and you're like, oh, there's all these things that I didn't do. I didn't, achieve that. What happens is your mind by default keeps reminding you of those things. So what that does is it creates continuous psychological attachment. So you're never able to separate yourself from your work because you're always thinking about what you didn't accomplish and what you didn't get done, which creates exhaustion and burnout. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is when you move into culling mode, you actually have to redefine success. And so what I tell people to do in that particular instance is success is no longer getting everything done on your list. It's getting done what you set out to get done that day. So be specific about what you intend to achieve today, and then measure your success of whether or not you accomplish that. And that's totally doable. And your list might be growing, but if you accomplish what you set out to accomplish, then you have closure and you can detach from your work at night and you can come back the next day feeling like, okay, I was effective yesterday.
Very interesting. What kind of tools, okay, so you're redefining your success, but establishing kind of some tools to start to do that, making a more specific list. Do you do that like suggest at the end of the day to prepare for the next day, to get that closure each day and start fresh each morning? Or what's those suggestions there?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about when it comes to productivity is to be an effective professional. And I would say, probably at least half of these things apply to being a student as well. But to be an effective professional, you need to have 7 systems. And I define a system as having 3 components. It's your personal habits and behaviors, it's the tools and technology that you use, and it's the protocols that govern your interactions with other people. So that's when you think about a system. So for example, what's your email management or your communication system, right? It's like, well, how often am I checking my email? That's my personal habits and behaviors. What am I using? Gmail? Am I using Outlook? Am I using my phone? That's the tools and technology. And then what is my sense of how quickly people expect a response from me and what type of response? So that's protocols. So that's when we're talking about a system. So you want to develop these 7 systems. And sorry, I actually forgot the original question. I got that. Do you remember?
It's very interesting. You're like, just the.
Oh yeah. I remember it now. You were asking about making a list. So task management system is one of the 7 systems, and task management system is how do you keep track of what you have to do and put it and help you make quick decisions about what to do next. And so what my recommendation is that everyone should have a to-do list where they're adding things to that they have to do. And that's an ongoing list. It's not something that you recreate every day. It should, and there's some exceptions, but for the most part, it should be a digital list. And so you add things to that every day. And then what you do on a daily basis, another one of the 7 systems is your calendar management system, is that you do what's called time blocking, where you look at your list, you prioritize them on your list, and then you figure out, what am I going to do today? And then you actually schedule time on your calendar to do it. Because many people engage in wishful thinking, where they say, oh yeah, this week I'm going to get this done, or I'm going to do this. And then you say, well, how much time is that going to take you? And they say, oh, well, 15 hours. And then you look at their calendar and you're like, so when do you have those 15 hours? Okay, you don't. Or it's during the night when you're tired and exhausted, and on the weekend when you don't want to be working. And I did a training, this was a few years ago, with some senior managers at a consulting firm. And I said to them, okay, I want you to look back over the last 2 weeks and tell me, how much time did you spend in meetings? So they calculated it up. And then I said, okay, on average, how much time do you spend reading and responding to emails in a given week? And they calculated that. And then I said, okay, last thing, how many hours do you expect or plan to work during a week? And what happened was they came back and said, basically between meetings and email, we're spending 40 to 45 hours a week. And most of them only wanted to work 45 to 50 hours. So I was like, how do you have any time to do the primary work that you're getting paid for, which is to add value to the client and do great thinking. And, and it basically was this eye-opening experience of like, okay, we engage in wishful thinking, thinking, oh yeah, I'm just going to get that done. I'm going to build that, slide presentation. I'm going to do that analysis, but you actually have no time. And so that's where time blocking comes in. You look at your list, you figure out, what am I going to do today? And then you actually schedule time into your calendar to do it, because then you can feel increased confidence that you'll actually be able to get that done.
You're unpacking a lot for somebody like me who kind of struggles with many of these areas. It's like, oh, wow. And some of it, like, we preparing for this conversation talked about perfectionism. And like, I don't know, I'm 51 and I feel like perfectionism is something I probably focused on when I was younger because it seemed more attainable. And now in my new role as executive director of this nonprofit, trying to do all of these things and this calendar and kind of being a scattered personality, it's like, wow, it's really a lot. And like, and then it's 2024 and all the different forms of communication and being to have to respond to people, instant messaging, direct messages on Instagram, traditional email, voicemail, instant messenger on Facebook. Like, there is a lot. How do you boil that all down and be effective and I want to think that I'm successful for my own well-being, marking off those things, being able to go to bed at night, not waking up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my gosh, this is too much. I'm not accomplishing anything. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think a lot of people are experiencing that especially now that we're constantly connected and there isn't that, kind of logical separation between work and life.
Well, that can lead into this next question. Work-life balance. What does that look like in 2024?
Yeah. And so I've talked about this a lot. So I have maybe a slightly different perspective on it, which is I think work-life balance is actually a potentially misleading term in that it can cause us to think about things in the wrong way. Because if we look at it technically, right? So work-life balance, when we think of balance, we think of even, right? And we say, okay, well, I'm going to spend. And so if you think about an average, in a week, you have 168 hours. And let's assume that you're sleeping about 7 hours a night. So that's about 50 hours. So let's just say you have about 120 hours to actually do work in life. And so that means if you were to have work-life balance in kind of a strict literal sense of the word, you'd be working 60 hours a week. And most people, they don't want to do that. And, I think if you look at evidence and research out there, most of it shows that when you get to like 50 to 55 hours, a lot of times people have challenges either health-wise or performance-wise where their actual marginal productivity, so like how much are they achieving per hour, goes down at about 50 to 55 hours. So the idea that you're trying to balance things in a kind of literal sense actually is not a helpful way to think about it. So the question is, what are you actually trying to achieve when it comes to the concept of work-life balance, which I think is appropriate? And there I like to say, what you want to do is you actually want to figure out your work-life equation. And that is, okay, you have these 168 hours and you're going to be spreading them between multiple things. And for me, I have probably like 3 or 4 different jobs, quote unquote. Zarvana is one of them, but I do a number of other different things. And then I also have 3 girls and I'm married and participate in church and community. And so for me, it's more about thinking about in this particular season, which usually is kind of like a 3-month period, how much time do I want to be allocating to those different categories of my life? And then I manage to that versus saying, kind of having a more nebulous concept of like trying to balance things. And because there's seasons like this past one for me where, as we talked a little bit about before, I was campaigning for a local office. And so, yeah, I was spending a lot of hours doing that, probably 50 to 60 in the last month. Right. And that was okay with me because that was how I defined my work-life equation in that particular season. Now, I couldn't continue that forever, or that would create problems for my other, professional obligations, my family, etc. And so really the way I like to think about it is, okay, going into this next season or this next period of time, how do you want to be spreading your time amongst your different obligations and things that you like to do? And then try to manage to that.
Hmm. I hear thinking a lot. Um, like, are you super intentional about like this equation and like every 3 months? I mean, is this something that you put on your calendar, or do you let it naturally happen? Or
I've gone through different cycles of intentionality. There were times when I basically, and that friend and I, who I mentioned early on, we use this tool called Toggle, which is a time tracker, and we literally tracked every task that we did during the work and how much time. And we did that for 2 months. And we both like data. And so we exported it all into Excel, and we started crunching the numbers and running analysis. And we were like, you know what? We're not really sure kind of how much this is driving decisions. And so what I found is that during different periods, what I do is I manage the top line. Okay, how much time am I spending overall in these different categories? Because a lot of times we make assumptions about that are not, our brains are not good at keeping track of quantities unless we're very intentional about it. So if you're like, oh yeah, I think like I'll have people who will say to me, oh yeah, I think I'm working about 40 hours a week. And then I'll say, okay, track it for 2 weeks. And they'll come back and they'll be like, oh, it's 52. And I was like, yeah, exactly. So we don't have a good concept of that. And so I think it is helpful to actually track your top line numbers depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. But to the extent you want to measure data and be intentional about it, I would say that you should focus on what are the goals I'm trying to achieve, and then what is the minimum amount I need to measure in order to manage those goals.
hmm. Again, there's a lot there. Okay, so lifestyle of continuous improvement. Fill us in.
Yeah. So one of the things on productivity that is a kind of core value or concept that I hold is, so the founder of the consulting firm that I worked at, and he said, he was the worldwide director of Bain & Company, which is like the top 3 consulting firm in the world before starting the consulting firm I worked at. And so he was working with all these like CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And what he said at one point in a small group I was in, he said, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm not the most talented or intuitive, but I'm the most productive. And that really stuck with me in that productivity is a greatest enabler of other things, because people are always limited in what they can do by the amount of time they have to do it. And so the problem is that when it comes, and this connects to your continuous improvement question, is that most people associate high performance with high productivity. So if I'm a good performer at my job, I think I'm naturally productive. But usually you're not actually. What happens is that you're actually just compensating for your lack of productivity by working harder. And so you're spending, the highest performers tend to work the most hours. And so what you need to do, if you want to become more productive, you generally need to self-impose a forcing function to cause yourself to become more productive, because the natural state of work isn't necessarily going to drive you to become more productive. What will happen is your work will overflow into more and more aspects of your life. And so with that, I'll give you an example of what I mean here. So when I was meeting with my friend every other week, my coworker and friend, and we at the time, what people did at this consulting firm is you worked on 2 projects at a time. You split your time about 50-50. And we said, okay, our stretch goal here is to be able to work on 3 projects in the same time that everyone else is doing 2. And that was kind of like our aspiration. And what that did is it actually caused us to be continually pushing the envelope, because otherwise we would have said, oh yeah, I'm working 40 hours a week, I'm working 45 hours a week, and kind of just get complacent. And if you get complacent, you won't actually drive towards continuous improvement. And so I was saying, okay, if I'm going to work in 50 hours, do 3 projects at the same time, I need to get down to 35 hours a week that I'm spending, or even 30 to 35 that I'm spending on 2 projects. So then I have space to do a third. And so that drove me to be continually saying, okay, what can I do better? How can I become more efficient? And so you need to create a forcing function in your world that drives you to basically continuously improve. And you need to have the belief that you can always become, in this case, we're talking about productivity, but it applies to other things, but you can always become more productive. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'm pretty productive. I'm like, I've been doing this for, between the time when I was at the consulting firm now and 10 years and at Zarvana, 10 years. And my personal belief is I can always become more productive. And so if you, who probably haven't been focusing on productivity that much, think that you've tapped out, no way, like totally not. And part of the reason that is true is because when I talked about systems, so we design, if I'm at, let's say, this level of busyness, and I design at my best, I design systems to function at that level of busyness. Sometimes we just kind of fall into systems. We don't actually design them intentionally. But in any case, our systems are designed to operate at our current level of busyness. Now, if my level of busyness increases by 25%, the systems that worked at the previous level of busyness actually don't work typically at that higher level of busyness. And so you need to redesign and improve your systems. And that's one of the hard things when people get a lot busier is they keep trying to force fit their systems that worked at a lower level of busyness into that higher level of busyness, and they don't work. And so what you have to, so that's another reason why you need to continuously improve, is because your level of busyness is changing. And if you're progressing through your career or through your life, you're likely getting more responsibility, more busy. And so you need to continue to evolve your systems in order for them to be optimized to that current level of busyness.
Interesting. Okay, there's two more topics that I want to touch on. And one being, what like advice would you have for a young college student or someone stepping into the field of just trying to achieve and that next step of being a professional, but to get through college to the best of their ability?
Yeah, I would say that, well, there's a few different ways I could go with this, that a lot of times we think about the field or the space that we're in as the core thing that we should be learning in college and even high school, so it's like, okay, I'm pre-med, so I should be like becoming an expert on chemistry, or I'm studying, design, and so I want to become an expert on design. And that's great, and you should do that. But what is equally important and can be prioritized more when you're in school is getting really good at the skills that enable you to do anything really well. And so that's, okay, how do I become super productive? How do I use critical thinking to make decisions, solve problems, develop recommendations? How do I communicate effectively? Because if you have those skills, increasingly, especially in the economy of today and in the future, those are the skills that differentiate us from AI and from the machines that are going to be able to do a lot of the design. Like, increasingly design can be automated. And so the things that actually enable us to perform and differentiate ourselves, both from other people and from machines, are those skills. And so I'd say focus on those things. And how do you build those skills and be intentional about it? And the other thing I would say is that the way I like to think about it is your internal strength. And this goes back to our first conversation, which is how do you manage stress? How do you manage pressure? If you can develop internal strength, and I kind of associate that with character, though they're related but separate issues, then that will enable you to do a lot more. And so, for example, I got really into willpower for a while, and there's a lot I could say about it. But if you think about, the way I like to think about it is that in order to get yourself to do a given task, it's kind of like in chemistry, they talk about activation energy. You need to get over the activation energy in order to accomplish a certain task. And so what is that activation energy? It's the sum of motivation and willpower. And motivation is an infinite resource. It doesn't run out, but you may have it or you may not. You can find motivation and you can lose motivation. Willpower is a finite resource that declines. And so what you want to think about is, okay, how do I build my capacity for willpower, which is how do I get myself to be able to do things I don't want to do? Because through any work that you're going to do, through anything that's hard, you're going to need willpower to get through it. And if you can develop that and increase your capacity, then you will be better equipped to be, successful in anything that you do, and internally successful, which is, in my opinion, more important. And so the last thing I'd say on this is, so I intentionally did 40 days of willpower workouts where I designed these ideas across physical, mental, emotional, and, intellectual, of things where it pushed the envelope, where I had to do things I didn't want to do and stretch that. And then what I said, and I gave myself 8 weeks, I said, okay, at the end of this 8 weeks, I want to do something that will be really hard for me and not train properly. Because if you train properly, it's kind of like, okay, that was hard and it took grit, but you're actually kind of prepared for it. And so I said, okay, I'm not really running right now. I mean, I would occasionally run 1 or 2 miles. And I said, okay, in 8 weeks from now, I'm going to run 50 miles through the mountains at a mile high or above, and I'm going to try to do it in 12 hours. And so I basically gave myself 8 weeks to train for that. I did these 40 days of willpower workouts leading up to that. And then I did it. I ended up doing 44 miles in 11 and a half hours. And my headlamp, basically the battery ran out, and I didn't do the last 6 miles. I probably should have, but in any case, I didn't do it. But that was like one of the hardest things I've ever done. But what that did is, when you put yourself in a situation where it feels, too hard, and you survive, you get through it, it expands the possibilities of what you think you can do. And I saw this quote from a Navy SEAL one time who said that when it comes to physical tests that the Navy SEALs are put through, it's almost never physical limitations that cause people to stop. It's mental limitations, which is the perception that you have to stop, that your body can't get you through it. And it's the same thing through most things that we go through in life. It's not that it's actually too much pressure for us to handle. It's that we've begun to believe that it's too much pressure. And so when you put yourself intentionally through something that's very difficult for yourself, it expands your conception of what is possible for you to get through, and expands, therefore, the things that you're able to do and take on and accomplish, and the level of stress and responsibility that you're able to manage.
Mm. Wow. Congratulations on building your willpower and putting yourself in a physical challenge. Super interesting. The other thing that I saw on your page that you're going to find out today officially, but you've been running in Redding, California, District 4 supervisor. I don't exactly know what that means. In different areas of the state or country, different things mean different things. But on your page, you wrote about considering alternatives and opposing opinions. And I felt like that was really something I just wanted to learn a little bit more about, because I feel like it's very important for today and for 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are living in a very polarized society. And one of the main challenges that I, find, and especially this is true in the political realm, but it extends much beyond that, is that we've come to believe, many of us have come to believe, that if we disagree with someone, we can't have a relationship with them. And that is, in fact, the opposite of what should be true. Because if you think in critical thinking, I spend time teaching companies this, the core principle of critical thinking is that the way you get to the best ideas and the best decisions is that you actually invite opposing viewpoints. Because if you only look at things through one side, you're missing things. Now, it may or may not be significant enough to change your decision, but you don't want to be missing information when you're making a decision. And so many of us live in these information silos where we're only getting our information from one perspective. And so we're making decisions that are suboptimal. And we think that anyone who has a different perspective than us actually is someone that we shouldn't have a relationship with. And so what happens is when we hear someone who says something different than us, then we actually dissociate from them. And then we also claim moral or intellectual superiority. And we say, oh, yeah, no, they don't know what they're talking about, or that's evil. This is a battle. We hear this a lot today. This is a battle between good and evil. And it's like, well, once you say that, the problem is, and this is, I could talk about this for a long time, but once you say it's a battle between good and evil, what you do then is you justify any one of your actions. Because if you're truly fighting evil, then it's like, well, what can I not do, right? And that is what causes people who start with the idea that they have moral superiority actually to engage in immoral behavior. And so instead of that, what we need to say is, I can disagree with you. And let me just say one other thing, which is the opposite of this is to say, I'm just going to tell you what I think you want me to hear. And politicians do that a lot because they want to get your vote, your money, your endorsements. And so they'll be like, oh, yeah, I know that you're thinking this. And so I'm going to kind of say something that I think you'll agree with it. That's obviously not helpful either. And so we need to be able to live in this place where we say, I'm going to tell you what I truly believe, and I'm going to stay in conversation. I'm going to stay in relationship with you, and we're going to be okay with those disagreements. And we're actually going to make each other better as a result of that without forcing each other to be perfectly aligned.
Thank you. We end every podcast, Matt, with the same question. What does the world need to hear right now?
Oh, that's a big question. I would say that it's a combination of two things that we just talked about. One is that that we need to learn to live with each other, even when we disagree with each other, and that we need to individually learn to build the internal strength to be able to handle the pressures that come at us and not treat them as a negative, but as something that will strengthen us.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt Plummer, for joining me today on a hopeful conversation. And to our listeners, be sure to tune into our next episode. Until then, remember, hold on, pain ends.